I should have seen it coming. I mean, there were signs, right? But, you know how it is, life keeps moving, and you just sort of let the little things slide. Maybe that was my first mistake. Sarah and I had been married for 7 years, and for most of it, things were great. We had no kids, and I thought that was something we both agreed on from the start. We liked our freedom, our quiet weekends, spontaneous trips, and dinners out at fancy restaurants without worrying about babysitters or tantrums. Sarah was never one for the traditional life, and that's part of what attracted me to her. She was fiery, independent, and strong-willed. I liked that about her, at first, at least. The last year or so, though, something changed. It was subtle at first, nothing that would set off any major alarms, just the usual complaints about work, a little more time spent with her friends, a few late nights at the office. She worked in marketing, and her firm was known for keeping their employees busy. She'd come home late sometimes, and I'd already be in bed. I'd ask her how her day was, and she'd give me the usual, busy. Exhausted. I just need to crash. Then she'd roll over and fall asleep. I never pushed. I didn't want to be the nagging husband. But things got worse. It wasn't just the late nights. It was the coldness. She stopped being affectionate. She'd barely kiss me goodbye in the mornings, and our sex life, which had always been pretty good, became non-existent. I chalked it up to stress. Everyone gets stressed out from work, right? I was stressed, too, but it didn't mean I'd stopped loving her. She still looked at me sometimes like I was a stranger, though. That's what really stung, the way she could be sitting right next to me, and I'd feel like I was miles away from her. I tried to talk to her about it once, about 6 months ago. We were having dinner, steaks on the grill, a bottle of red wine, trying to do that whole rekindle the romance thing. I asked her if something was bothering her, if there was anything I could do to make things easier. She brushed me off. Told me I was imagining things. That she was just tired, that work had been especially brutal lately. I believed her. I wanted to believe her. After all, what kind of husband would I be if I didn't trust my wife? But there were more signs. Like how she suddenly got obsessed with her phone. She used to leave it lying around the house, and now it was glued to her hand. She'd tilt the screen away when I was nearby. One time, I caught her quickly swiping away a message when I sat down next to her on the couch. I asked her who it was, and she got defensive, saying it was just a friend from work. It didn't sit right with me, but I let it go. That's the problem with trust. You can't just let it halfway in. You either trust someone or you don't. And up until recently, I trusted her completely. Then the business trips started. Sarah had always traveled for work, but not like this. She'd go out of town maybe once or twice a year for a conference or a big client meeting. Lately, it seemed like she was gone every other week. New clients, she'd say, big account I'm trying to land. I wanted to be supportive, so I didn't question it. But the thing is, it wasn't just the trips. It was how different she acted when she was about to leave. She'd be all excited, packing her bags like she was going on some vacation. And when she'd come back, she'd seem, I don't know, distant. Detached. It was like every trip she took, she came back a little less interested in me, in us. Last month, she left for a 3-day trip to Chicago. It wasn't anything unusual, just another work trip, or so she said. She was gone for the weekend, and I didn't hear much from her. A text here or there, nothing out of the ordinary. But when she came back, she was different. Cold. Like she couldn't stand to be in the same room as me. When I tried to kiss her, she turned her head, like it physically hurt her to touch me. That's when I knew. I couldn't explain how or why, but I knew something was wrong. Deep down, I could feel it, gnawing at me like a bad itch. But I didn't confront her. Not yet. I wanted to believe it was all in my head, that maybe we just needed to reconnect. So I planned a surprise weekend getaway for us. I booked a cabin up in the mountains, packed a bag, and told her we were leaving Friday after work. She seemed less than thrilled, but she agreed to go. That weekend was a disaster. She barely spoke to me, spent half the time glued to her phone, and when I tried to initiate anything intimate, she shut me down hard. It wasn't just rejection, it was disgust. That's the only way I can describe it. She looked at me like I was repulsive, like the thought of being with me physically made her sick. We drove back on Sunday in silence, the tension in the car so thick you could have cut it with a knife. I spent the next week in a fog, replaying everything in my head. What the hell had happened to us? Where did I go wrong? I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something she wasn't telling me, something big. I tried to ignore it, but it was there, eating away at me, until I couldn't take it anymore. And that's when I made the decision to find out the truth. I couldn't take it anymore. There was something going on with Sarah, and I needed to know exactly what it was. My mind kept running wild with all sorts of ideas. Was she seeing someone? Was it someone from work? Was that why she was so cold, why she was avoiding me like the plague? Every time she pulled away, every time she flinched when I tried to touch her, it only made me more sure that she was hiding something. But I needed proof, cold, hard evidence. So, I did something I'm not exactly proud of. I bought a couple of those small, hidden cameras. The ones that look like phone chargers, completely inconspicuous. I figured if she was up to something, this would catch it. The plan was simple. I'd tell her I had a business trip coming up and would be out of town for a few days. Then, I'd set the cameras up before I left, and catch her in the act if there was anything to catch. The day I put the plan into motion was tense. I told her over breakfast that I had to go to a client meeting in another city. She barely looked up from her phone, just mumbled something like, "Okay, have a safe trip." She didn't even ask when I'd be back. She didn't care. That only fueled my suspicion. Something was definitely off. Later that day, while she was at work, I set up the cameras. One in the living room, one in the bedroom, places where I figured anything might go down. I tried not to feel like a complete scumbag as I did it. I mean, who installs cameras in their own house to spy on their wife? But this wasn't about paranoia anymore. This was about the truth, about figuring out what the hell had happened to my marriage. When everything was in place, I packed a small bag and left the house, just like I said I would. But I didn't go far. I checked into a cheap motel just outside of town, somewhere close enough to get back quickly if I needed to. Then, I parked myself at a nearby cafe with my laptop and started streaming the footage from the cameras. For the first few hours, nothing happened. The house was empty, quiet, like it always was when I wasn't there. Sarah got home around 6 p.m., like she usually did. She wandered around the house, checking her phone, not doing much of anything. For a moment, I thought maybe I was wrong, that maybe she was just going through something and I was making it worse by being suspicious. Then, around 8 p.m., her phone rang. She picked it up, and even though I couldn't hear the conversation, her body language told me everything. She smiled. Not the half-hearted smile she gave me, but a real, genuine smile. Whoever was on the other end of that call was making her happy. My stomach tightened. She spoke for a few minutes, then hung up and started straightening up the living room, almost like she was expecting company. I was glued to the screen, my heart racing. Was this it? Was she about to bring someone over? My worst fear was about to be confirmed, and part of me didn't want to see it. But I couldn't look away. A little after 9 p.m., the doorbell rang. I watched as she practically skipped to the door. When she opened it, I got my first look at the guy. He was younger than me, probably a few years younger than Sarah, too. Tall, athletic-looking. He didn't even hesitate, just walked right in and pulled her into a kiss. I felt like I'd been punched in the gut. There it was. Proof. She was cheating. I sat there in that cafe, watching as they made their way to the living room, kissing and laughing like they didn't have a care in the world. Like I didn't even exist. She didn't waste any time either. She practically jumped on him, pulling at his shirt, kissing him like she hadn't kissed me in years. It was surreal, watching my wife, the woman I'd shared my life with, throw herself at another man in our home. The home I'd worked so hard to make for us. They didn't stay in the living room for long. Soon enough, they were heading upstairs, to our bedroom. My blood boiled as I watched them strip down. I couldn't take it anymore. I slammed my laptop shut and left the cafe, my mind racing with what to do next. I wasn't thinking straight, but I knew one thing for sure: I wasn't going to let this slide. I drove straight to the house. By the time I got there, I was shaking with anger. I knew what I was about to walk in on, but nothing could have prepared me for the reality of it. I quietly let myself in. The house was dark except for the faint glow coming from the bedroom upstairs. I could hear them before I even reached the top of the stairs. Her voice, her moans, it made my stomach turn. The same sounds she used to make with me, now for someone else. I didn't even bother being quiet as I approached the bedroom door. I wanted them to know I was there. I wanted them to feel the same shock and betrayal I was feeling. I shoved the door open, and there they were, naked and tangled in our bed. They didn't even notice me at first. They were too busy fucking. It wasn't until I said something I can't even remember now, through the red haze of anger, that they stopped. Sarah froze, her eyes wide with shock. The guy, who the hell was this guy, scrambled to cover himself, stammering like a deer caught in headlights. But I didn't care about him. My eyes were locked on Sarah. She didn't say a word, didn't even try to explain. She just sat there, staring at me, like I was the one who had done something wrong. For a moment, no one said anything. The only sound in the room was my own ragged breathing and the pounding of my heart in my ears. I just stood there, staring at Sarah and this guy in our bed, unable to believe what I was seeing. There was a split second where I thought maybe I'd imagined the whole thing, maybe this was just some sick dream. But it wasn't. It was all too real. Sarah was sitting there, clutching the bedsheet to her chest like that was going to somehow shield her from what was happening. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with shock, but she didn't say a damn thing. Not an apology, not a word of explanation, nothing. Just that blank stare, like she didn't even know who I was anymore. The guy, on the other hand, was scrambling like a rat caught in a trap. He was younger than me, maybe late 20s, all lean muscle and panic in his eyes. He stammered something, some half-assed excuse or maybe an apology. I wasn't even listening. I didn't care what he had to say. The only thing going through my mind was that this prick had just been in my house, in my bed, screwing my wife. I could feel my blood boiling, every muscle in my body tensing as I stood there. I didn't know if I was going to hit him, scream at him, or just break down right there on the spot. But I wasn't going to let him stay in my house another second. "Get the fuck out," I growled, my voice low and dangerous. He looked at me, eyes wide, like he couldn't believe what was happening. Like I was supposed to be the one feeling sorry for him. He glanced at Sarah, maybe expecting her to step in, to say something, but she stayed frozen, clutching that sheet like her life depended on it. She still hadn't said a word. "Did you not fucking hear me?" I said, louder this time. "Get out." That's when he started moving, fast. He stumbled out of the bed, grabbing his clothes off the floor as he tried to dress himself. He was shaking, tripping over his own feet as he pulled on his pants. I watched him, my hands clenched into fists at my sides, barely holding myself back from lunging at him. I wanted to hit him so badly. I wanted to break every bone in his face, to make him feel just a fraction of the pain I was feeling right then. But I didn't. I wasn't going to give him the satisfaction of seeing me lose control. He wasn't worth it. The guy finally got his clothes on, at least, enough to cover himself, and bolted for the door. He muttered some sort of "I'm sorry, man," but I wasn't hearing it. I didn't give a damn what he had to say. I just wanted him gone. He practically sprinted down the stairs, tripping over himself as he made his way out the front door. I didn't follow him. I didn't need to. I could hear the front door slam shut behind him, and just like that, he was gone. Good riddance. I stood there for a moment, staring at the empty doorway where he'd just disappeared. My chest was heaving, adrenaline still coursing through me, but at least the house was quiet now. The only problem was, Sarah was still there. I turned slowly to face her. She was still sitting on the edge of the bed, the sheets wrapped tightly around her naked body, like she was afraid I might rip them away from her. She looked so small and pathetic, huddled there, with no excuses left to hide behind. For the first time in our whole relationship, she looked scared of me. Good. She should have been. So this is what you've been doing? I said, my voice shaking with barely contained rage. This is what all those late nights and business trips were about. Sarah flinched at my words but still didn't say anything. Her eyes darted around the room, like she was looking for an escape, but there wasn't one. She was trapped here, and there was no talking her way out of this. Answer me, I demanded, stepping closer to her. How long, Sarah? How fucking long has this been going on? She swallowed hard, finally opening her mouth to speak, but the words came out weak and shaky. It's not what you think, she mumbled, her voice barely audible. I can explain. Explain? I let out a bitter laugh. I just walked in on you fucking some guy in our bed, and you want to explain? Do you think I'm fucking stupid? She shook her head, tears starting to well up in her eyes. No, it's not like that. I didn't mean for this to happen. Oh, so it just happened, huh? I snapped. You just accidentally ended up screwing some random guy in our bed? Spare me, Sarah. Her tears started falling then, and she wiped at her face with the back of her hand, still clutching the sheet with the other. I'm sorry, she whispered. I didn't mean to hurt you. The rage inside me flared up again. You didn't mean to hurt me? I shouted, taking another step toward her. You've been lying to me for God knows how long, and you didn't mean to hurt me? She flinched again, looking down at her lap. I didn't know what else to do, she said softly. I didn't want to lose you, but You didn't want to lose me? I cut her off, my voice rising. So you thought screwing some guy behind my back was the best way to keep me? How does that make any sense? I don't know, she cried, finally looking up at me, her eyes red and swollen with tears. I don't know why I did it. I was lonely. I didn't mean for it to get this far. I shook my head in disbelief. Lonely? You were lonely? What about me, Sarah? Did you ever stop to think how lonely I was while you were sneaking around with him? Did you ever give a shit about what this would do to me? She was sobbing now, her whole body shaking as she sat there, but I didn't care. Her tears didn't mean anything to me anymore. They were just another lie, another manipulation. Please, she begged, her voice breaking. I'm sorry. I'll stop. It won't happen again. I stared at her for a long moment, the anger and betrayal coursing through me like fire. I wanted to believe her. I wanted to believe that this was just a mistake, that we could somehow fix this. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. This wasn't some one-time screw-up. This was a betrayal, a choice she made over and over again. And I was done. You're right about one thing, I said, my voice low and cold. It won't happen again. Her eyes widened in panic. Wait, what are you? But I didn't wait for her to finish. I turned and walked out of the bedroom, leaving her there, crying and begging for forgiveness. I didn't want to hear it. There was nothing left to say. I had all the answers I needed, and now, I just wanted to be as far away from her as possible. As I walked out of the house and slammed the door behind me, I felt a strange sense of relief. The storm wasn't over, not by a long shot, but at least I wasn't trapped in that house with her anymore. As I left the house, slamming the door behind me, my mind was buzzing. My blood was still boiling, my fist still clenched, but there was something else, a calmness creeping in beneath the rage. A kind of clarity. I knew what I needed to do, and I wasn't going to let her get away with this. Not after everything. She wanted to fuck around behind my back? Fine. But I wasn't going to be the guy who just walks away quietly, pretending like nothing happened. No, Sarah was going to pay for this. I'd make sure of that. I didn't go far. I parked down the street, just outside of view from the house, and sat there in the dark, letting the anger simmer. The whole scene kept replaying in my head, her on the bed, the guy scrambling to cover himself, her tear-streaked face as she tried to explain. But it wasn't the explanations or the tears that stayed with me. It was the betrayal. It was the way she looked at me like I was some obstacle, an inconvenience in her life. Like she couldn't even be bothered to care anymore. I wasn't going to let her walk away from this without consequences. And that's when it hit me, the cameras. I had everything on video. Every kiss, every touch, every bit of that betrayal. She thought she could hide it, thought she could lie her way through it like it was just some harmless affair. But I had proof. I had cold, undeniable proof of exactly who she really was. I drove back to the motel and set up my laptop again, pulling up the footage from the cameras. My hands were still shaking as I clicked through the files, but this time, it wasn't just rage fueling me. It was something darker. This was the moment where everything changed. I wasn't going to let her cry her way out of this. No more apologies. No more excuses. It was time for her to feel what I'd been feeling since the moment I walked in on her screwing that guy in our bed. The footage was perfect. Every second of it was there, the way she kissed him at the door, the way she undressed him, the way they laughed together as if nothing else in the world mattered. And then, of course, there was the part where they made their way upstairs and did exactly what I knew they'd been doing for months. It was all right there. Crystal clear. I wasn't going to hold back. Sarah deserved to have her life ripped apart just like she'd done to mine. The video was enough to do it. I started thinking about how to play it. I knew Sarah had a reputation to maintain. She wasn't some anonymous woman. She had her little social circle, her friends, her colleagues, her perfect image as the successful, put-together woman who had it all. The perfect job, the perfect husband, the perfect life. Except now I had a front-row seat to the reality of who she really was. And I was going to make sure everyone else saw it too. I pulled out my phone and started gathering contact information. Her friends, her boss, the people she worked with, all of them were about to get a little surprise. I compiled a list of email addresses, making sure I didn't miss anyone important. I didn't rush it. I wanted to do it right. Each step was calculated, cold. There was no going back from this, but I didn't care. Sarah had made her choice, and now it was my turn to make mine. I edited the video, making sure it was just the right length enough to leave no doubt about what was happening, but not so much that it became excessive. It wasn't about pornography or getting off on the pain. It was about sending a message, about showing everyone the truth. I added a brief message to the email. To whom it may concern. I thought you all should see the real Sarah. The one she hides from everyone. The woman who spends her nights fucking another man in the bed she shares with her husband. She's been lying to all of us. It's time you knew the truth. I attached the video and hit send. It was done. I sat back in the cheap motel chair, watching the emails disappear from my outbox one by one, a strange sense of satisfaction washing over me. I could only imagine what would happen when the messages started coming through on their end, the shock, the disgust, the judgment. I could picture her boss opening his email and seeing the woman he trusted caught in the middle of her affair. Her friends, the ones who looked up to her, would see her for who she really was. A liar. A cheat. Someone who couldn't even respect her own marriage. And Sarah? She'd be blindsided. It didn't take long for the fallout to start. My phone began buzzing with messages, some from numbers I recognized, others from people I didn't. I didn't answer any of them. I didn't care what anyone had to say. This wasn't about having a conversation. It was about setting things on fire and watching them burn. About an hour later, Sarah started blowing up my phone. Calls, texts, voicemails. Each one more frantic than the last. What the fuck did you do? Are you out of your mind? You've ruined my life. The irony of that last one made me laugh. I'd ruined her life? The nerve. She was the one who had destroyed everything, and now she was acting like I was the villain in all this. I didn't bother responding. There was nothing to say. She deserved every bit of what was happening, and deep down, she knew it. The texts kept coming, alternating between pleading and rage. Please, we can fix this. I'll do anything. How could you do this to me? You bastard. You've ruined me. I didn't answer. I didn't have to. The damage was already done. Sarah's life was unraveling in real time, and I could see it happening right in front of me. I could practically hear the walls of her perfect little world collapsing, piece by piece. A few hours later, my phone rang again, but this time it was a number I didn't recognize. I was about to ignore it, but something made me pick up. Hello? Is this Mark? The voice on the other end asked, the tone cautious but firm. Yeah, I replied, my jaw tightening. This is Sarah's boss, Greg. I think we need to talk. Of course, it was Greg. Sarah's boss. The guy she'd always gone on about, the one she was so desperate to impress. I could imagine the look on his face when he'd opened that email. I wondered how many other people at her company had seen it too. How many of her colleagues were talking about her right now? There's nothing to talk about, I said flatly. You saw the video. You know what's going on. Greg sighed heavily. Look, I don't know what went down between you two, but this is going to have serious consequences. For both of you. I almost laughed at that. Consequences? For me? What did he think I cared about anymore? I don't give a shit about the consequences, Greg. Your perfect employee's been screwing around behind my back for who knows how long. I'm just letting people know the truth. There was a long pause on the other end of the line before Greg spoke again, his tone softer this time. I get that you're hurt, man, but this isn't the way to handle it. I clenched my teeth, gripping the phone tighter. I didn't need some guy who barely knew me telling me how to handle my own life. I've already handled it, I said coldly. And if you're worried about what this does to her job, that's not my problem. She made her choice. Now she has to live with it. Before he could respond, I hung up the phone. I spent the rest of the night in the motel, ignoring the endless calls and messages. I didn't need to hear any more of her excuses. I didn't need to know how much she hated me now. All that mattered was that, for once, I was in control. I'd been the one humiliated, the one who was left to feel like an idiot while she paraded around with some other guy. Now the tables had turned. As I lay in the dark, staring at the ceiling, I didn't feel regret. Maybe that's what surprised me the most. I thought I'd feel guilty or second-guess myself, but there was none of that. All I could think about was what she must be going through right now. Her perfect little world, shattered. She'd be humiliated, outcast, everything she valued crumbling around her. And that was exactly what I wanted. Divorce? That could wait. I wasn't finished yet. The fallout with Sarah had barely begun when a new thought crept into my head. What about him? The guy who had just been in my house, screwing my wife. He'd gotten off easy running out of there with his tail between his legs. But it wasn't enough. No way was I going to let him walk away without consequences. Sarah wasn't the only one who deserved to have her life destroyed. I didn't even know his name at first, but I had enough to go on. That smug, panicked face was burned into my memory. I spent the next day doing a little digging. Social media can tell you a lot about a person, especially if they aren't smart enough to hide their private life. It didn't take me long to find him. Turns out, his name was Brian, and the asshole wasn't some random fling. He worked with Sarah. Of course. They probably met during one of those late-night work sessions. But that wasn't the interesting part. What really caught my attention was that Brian wasn't single. He had a wife. The idea hit me like a freight train. He has a wife. Suddenly, everything felt different. This wasn't just some casual affair. This was a whole other level of betrayal. And if Brian thought he could just go back to his life, like nothing ever happened, I was about to blow that illusion sky high. He wasn't just screwing with me, he was betraying his own family. I found his wife's profile easily enough. Her name was Amy. She looked happy in her photos, smiling with Brian in some fancy vacation shots, holding hands at weddings, all the usual couple stuff. The typical perfect life, just like Sarah and I had once pretended to have. It made me sick just looking at it. I knew exactly what I needed to do. I saved the video footage of Brian with Sarah, the same one I'd sent to Sarah's friends and colleagues. This time, I edited it down a bit, making sure it was clear who he was and exactly what he was doing. The footage of him undressing Sarah, the two of them in bed, it was all there. And it was damning. Once I had it ready, I drafted an email to Amy. I didn't try to sugarcoat it, didn't try to soften the blow. She deserved to know the truth, just like I had. I didn't care how much it hurt. She had a right to see what kind of man her husband really was. Subject: you deserve to know the truth. Body: Amy, you don't know me, but I think it's time you learned the truth about your husband. I don't want to be the one to break this to you, but you deserve to see what's really going on behind your back. My wife, Sarah, has been having an affair with your husband, Brian. They've been meeting up in our home, and it's been going on for who knows how long. Here's the proof. I'm sorry you have to find out this way, but you need to see what kind of man you're married to. Attachment: video file. Once I hit send, there was no going back. I leaned back in my chair, feeling the weight of what I'd just done. But again, there was no regret. Brian had walked into my life, into my home, and torn it apart. Now it was my turn to return the favor. I didn't have to wait long. Within the hour, my phone buzzed. It was a message from a number I didn't recognize, but I knew immediately who it was. "Who the hell are you?" I smirked at the screen. He must have figured it out the moment Amy got the email. I didn't reply. I didn't need to explain myself to him. But the messages kept coming. "What do you think you're doing? You need to delete that video, now. You're going to ruin my life." I didn't respond to any of it. Let him squirm. Let him panic. He deserved every bit of it. I could imagine the scene at Brian's house right now, Amy confronting him, screaming at him, throwing things, demanding answers. I pictured her watching the video, seeing her husband with another woman, the same way I had. There was a grim satisfaction in knowing I wasn't the only one going through this hell anymore. Brian's world was collapsing around him, and I wasn't going to lift a finger to help. About an hour later, my phone rang. I didn't even have to look to know who it was. Brian. I let it ring a few times before picking up, letting the silence drag out. "Yeah?" I answered, my voice cold, detached. "Mark, listen," he started, his voice strained. "You have no idea what you've done. Amy saw the video. She's threatening to leave me. You can't just send that stuff to people. You're destroying lives." The hypocrisy of it all nearly made me laugh. "I'm destroying lives?" I shot back. "You fucked my wife, Brian. You came into my home and wrecked my marriage, and now you're pissed because your wife found out? You've got some fucking nerve." "It wasn't supposed to be like this," he stammered. It was a mistake. I didn't mean for this to happen." "Didn't mean for it to happen?" I scoffed. "You didn't seem like you were accidentally screwing my wife last night. You made your bed, man. Now you get to lie in it." "Please," he begged, his voice cracking. "You don't understand. Amy's going to take the kids. She's going to ruin me. You can't let her do this. Please, man, I'm begging you." That's when it hit me, he had kids. Brian had fucking kids. The realization made my stomach turn. He wasn't just betraying his wife. He was screwing over his whole family. Part of me wanted to feel bad for them. The kids didn't deserve this. But that feeling didn't last long. Brian had made his choices. This wasn't my fault. This was all on him. "You should have thought about that before you decided to sleep with my wife," I said, my voice cold. "You want to save your marriage?" Go ahead. Try. But don't put this on me. You're the one who ruined your life, not me. There was a long silence on the other end. I could hear him breathing, the sound of someone barely holding it together. Please, he whispered again, but there was nothing left to say. I hung up. The next few days were quiet. I didn't hear from Brian again, and Amy didn't reach out to me either. I wasn't sure what was happening in their household, but I could only imagine it was a living hell. I kept waiting for some kind of backlash, maybe from Sarah, maybe from Brian's lawyer, but nothing came. Not yet, at least. Sarah hadn't contacted me much either, apart from a few angry texts accusing me of being vindictive and cruel. As if she hadn't been the one who put all of this in motion. She was still trying to figure out how to dig herself out of the mess she'd made. It was almost funny. Almost. But I wasn't done yet. The divorce was coming, just not yet. For now, I was content to watch as the lives of the people who had betrayed me crumbled around them. Brian thought he could have his fun, destroy my marriage, and walk away unscathed. Now he was learning the hard way that actions have consequences. And those consequences were just getting started. I hadn't heard from Sarah in days. Not since I sent the video to Amy and blew up Brian's life. She tried to reach out a couple of times, mostly through angry texts and a few missed calls. But I ignored all of it. There was nothing left to say, or at least that's what I told myself. In reality, I knew there was one final conversation waiting to happen, and I was dreading it. The divorce. After everything I'd done, after every ounce of revenge I'd dished out, there was still the fact that I had to close this chapter of my life. It wasn't just about revenge anymore. It was about moving on, about facing the reality that our marriage, if you could still even call it that, was over. The days passed, and I knew it was only a matter of time before Sarah forced a conversation. I couldn't avoid it forever. And sure enough, one evening, as I sat in the half-empty house, the doorbell rang. I opened the door to find Sarah standing there, looking like hell. Her hair was a mess, her face puffy from crying. She looked small, vulnerable, like she was a shadow of the person she used to be. For a moment, I almost felt sorry for her. Almost. "Can we talk?" she asked, her voice shaky, barely above a whisper. I stood there for a second, debating whether to slam the door in her face or let her in. Part of me didn't want to deal with it. I was tired. Tired of the lies, the betrayal, the emotional roller coaster she'd put me on. But I knew we couldn't avoid this any longer. We needed to have this conversation. So, I stepped aside and let her in. She walked into the living room, looking around like she didn't recognize the place. I guess, in a way, neither of us did anymore. It wasn't the same home it had been when we were happy. Now it was just four walls filled with the wreckage of our broken marriage. I sat down on the couch, and she stood there for a moment, wringing her hands nervously before she sat down on the opposite end, as far away from me as she could. The silence between us was thick, suffocating. Neither of us knew how to start. Finally, she spoke. I'm sorry," she said, her voice barely audible. I just stared at her, waiting for her to continue. I wasn't going to make this easy for her. "I know I screwed up," she said, her eyes filling with tears. "I know I hurt you. And I know you'll probably never forgive me for what I did." "You're right about that," I said coldly. She flinched, wiping at her eyes. "I didn't mean for any of this to happen. I don't even know how it got this far. I was lonely. You were so distant, so focused on work, and I. Don't you dare try to blame this on me," I snapped, cutting her off. "You were lonely? That's your excuse? You could have come to me. We could have worked through it. But instead, you decided to screw someone else behind my back. You made that choice, Sarah. You." She didn't say anything for a moment, just stared at her lap, tears silently streaming down her face. "I know," she whispered. "I know I made a mistake." "A mistake?" I scoffed. "That's what you're calling it? A mistake? This wasn't some one-night slip-up, Sarah. You were having an affair. 4 months. You lied to me, over and over again, every time you looked me in the eye and pretended nothing was wrong. Her sobs got louder, and she buried her face in her hands. I didn't want to lose you, she cried. I didn't mean to hurt you. You didn't mean to hurt me? I laughed bitterly. You've been hurting me for months. Every time you went to see him, every time you let him touch you, you were killing us. You killed this marriage, Sarah. You did. I know, she sobbed. I know. I don't know why I did it. I don't know what's wrong with me. I didn't respond. What was there to say? She was broken, and maybe part of me wanted to feel sorry for her, to tell her that it was okay, that we could figure it out. But I couldn't. Not anymore. Too much had happened. Too much damage had been done. We sat there in silence for a long time, her crying quietly and me staring at the floor, trying to find the right words for what came next. I knew I had to say it. I had to bring up the divorce. Sarah, I finally said, my voice steady. This is over. We can't fix this. Her head shot up, her eyes wide and desperate. No, she whispered. Please, Mark. Don't say that. We can work through this. We can go to counseling, we can try. There's nothing left to try, I interrupted. There's nothing left to save. You've destroyed it all. I can't trust you anymore. I can't even look at you without seeing what you did, without thinking about him. She shook her head, reaching out toward me, but I pulled back, not letting her touch me. Please, she begged, her voice breaking. I'll do anything. I'll cut him off, I'll quit my job, whatever it takes. Just don't leave me. Her words hung in the air, thick with desperation. But they meant nothing to me. I was past the point of no return. I'd given her everything, and she'd thrown it away. Now it was time to walk away. I'm filing for divorce, I said, my voice cold and final. She stared at me, her eyes wide, like she couldn't believe what she was hearing. No, she whispered. No, you can't. I can, and I will, I said firmly. You made your choice. Now I'm making mine. The sobs returned, louder this time, as she collapsed into herself, her whole body shaking. Please, Mark, she cried. I love you. I don't want to lose you. Do you even know what love is? I shot back, my anger rising again. Because if this is what love looks like to you, I don't want any part of it. She didn't respond, just kept crying, her body curled up on the couch like a child. I watched her, feeling nothing but emptiness. There was no satisfaction in this, no victory. Just the cold, hard reality of what was left between us, nothing. I stood up, needing to get out of the room, away from her sobbing, away from the suffocating weight of our failed marriage. I'll have my lawyer send over the papers, I said as I walked toward the door. Mark, please, she begged one last time, her voice hoarse from crying. I paused, my hand on the doorknob, but I didn't turn around. Goodbye, Sarah, I said quietly, and with that, I walked out. As I stepped outside into the cool night air, the weight of it all hit me. It was over. Really, truly over. There was no going back now. The divorce would be messy, it would be painful, but it was necessary. It was the only way forward. I walked to my car, my heart heavy, my mind numb. There was no more rage, no more fire. Just exhaustion. But as I drove away from the house, from the wreckage of my marriage, there was a small part of me that felt a strange sense of relief. It wasn't over yet. There were still papers to sign, lawyers to deal with, and the fallout of everything I'd done. But at least I was free. At least I wasn't trapped in that lie anymore. For the first time in months, I could breathe again. The relief I felt driving away from Sarah that night didn't last long. It was a temporary respite, a brief moment of clarity before the storm hit again. The days that followed were a blur of legal meetings, emails, and paperwork. Divorce, I quickly learned, is never simple. It's messy, it's painful, and it drags on far longer than you want it to. I got in touch with my lawyer the next day and explained the situation. She didn't seem surprised. Divorce lawyers never are. They've seen it all before: the cheating, the lies, the anger. I handed her everything: the texts, the emails, the video. She assured me it would be an open and shut case. In a way, that felt good. Sarah had no leg to stand on, and I knew I had all the proof I needed to walk away with everything intact. But it didn't stop the sinking feeling in my gut. The court process was slow. Sarah tried to play nice at first, telling me through her lawyer that she wanted to keep things amicable. But I wasn't interested in playing nice. There was nothing to be amicable about anymore. She had ruined us, and I wasn't about to give her a free pass to walk away without consequences. The first time we were both in the same room again was during a meeting with our lawyers. It was a sterile, gray conference room in some office downtown. Sarah sat across from me, looking smaller than I'd ever seen her. She didn't even look me in the eye. Her lawyer spoke for her most of the time, laying out what she wanted from the settlement. She was hoping to keep the house, of course, as well as some alimony to get back on her feet. I nearly laughed. She wants what? I asked my lawyer, incredulous. She's the one who cheated. Why should I have to pay her a damn thing? My lawyer nodded, already knowing this was coming. It's standard, she explained. But don't worry, with the evidence we have, she's not getting much. The house is yours. Sarah finally spoke up, her voice quiet, barely above a whisper. Mark, please. I need time. I'll move out, but I just need a little time to figure things out. Her words hung in the air, and for a moment, I almost felt sorry for her again. Almost. But then I remembered everything: the lies, the betrayal, the image of her with Brian in our bed. Any sympathy I might have had vanished. I shook my head. You've had enough time, Sarah. I'm done waiting. Her eyes filled with tears, but I didn't care. I wasn't going to fall for it again. The meeting continued, tense and uncomfortable, but by the end of it, we had a basic agreement in place. The house was mine, and I wouldn't be paying her a cent in alimony. The judge still had to approve everything, but it was as good as done. After the meeting, Sarah tried to approach me, but I walked away before she could say anything. There was nothing left to say. This wasn't about feelings anymore. It was about cutting ties, about finally getting rid of the weight of her betrayal and moving on with my life. I wasn't interested in apologies or explanations. She'd already said enough. The next few weeks were filled with more paperwork, more legal jargon that I barely understood. It was exhausting. Every day felt like a battle just to keep moving forward. But as the divorce process inched closer to the finish line, I started to feel something I hadn't felt in months: freedom. Sarah moved out of the house about a month after that initial meeting. She didn't make a scene, didn't try to argue. She just packed up her things and left quietly. I wasn't there when it happened. I didn't want to see her walk out the door with the remnants of our life together. When I came back later that evening, the house felt emptier, but lighter too. Like a weight had been lifted. I stood in the middle of the living room, staring at the bare walls, the empty spaces where her things had been. It wasn't the same house I'd built with her. It wasn't the same place where we'd planned a future together. It was just a shell now, a reminder of what we'd lost. But that was okay. I wasn't going to hold on to the past anymore. I had spent too much time clinging to something that was already gone. The court date finally came, a quiet affair that felt almost anticlimactic. We stood before the judge, the legal documents spread out in front of us. It was all so formal, so clinical. The judge asked the usual questions, confirming the details of our agreement. I barely paid attention. I just wanted it to be over. When the gavel finally came down, the judge's voice was monotone. Divorce granted. Just like that, it was done. Sarah didn't say anything as we left the courtroom. She glanced at me once, but I didn't look back. I couldn't. I just walked out, not even pausing to see if she followed. There was no point. Our lives had already diverged. I walked out of that courthouse feeling lighter, but not in the way I expected. There wasn't any sense of triumph or satisfaction. There was no victory lap. It wasn't like in the movies, where the character walks away with some new sense of purpose or joy. I was just tired. It was more like shedding an old skin, like walking out of a storm into the calm afterward. I wasn't happy, but at least the chaos was over. The next few weeks were strange. The house was quieter, but I started to get used to the silence. I sold a lot of the furniture Sarah had picked out, redecorated the place to make it feel more like mine. The process of rebuilding wasn't easy. There were days when the weight of everything hit me all over again, when the memories of her betrayal would creep back in. But each day was a little better than the last. Brian? I heard from Amy once. She sent me a brief email thanking me for sending her the video, letting me know that she had filed for divorce. I didn't respond. It wasn't my place to get involved in her mess anymore, but it was good to know Brian was getting exactly what he deserved. That gave me some closure. As for Sarah, I didn't hear from her again after the divorce was finalized. I didn't expect to. Whatever relationship we'd had was long dead, and there was no reason to keep picking at the bones. The last conversation we had in that conference room was the end of it. The final nail in the coffin of our marriage. Life moved on. It wasn't easy, and it wasn't quick, but I started to find my footing again. I spent more time with friends, threw myself into work, and slowly started piecing together who I was without her. It was a strange, sometimes lonely process, but there was something freeing about it too. I wasn't defined by her anymore. I wasn't defined by the betrayal or the pain. I was just me again. One evening, a few months after the divorce was finalized, I found myself sitting on the back porch with a drink in my hand, watching the sunset. It was quiet, peaceful. For the first time in a long time, I wasn't thinking about Sarah, or Brian, or any of the chaos they'd brought into my life. I was just still. Maybe that's what healing looks like. Not some grand moment of epiphany or triumph, but just the quiet realization that you're okay. That you survived. That life, in all its messiness and unpredictability, keeps moving forward. And so did I.